Imagine you are standing on the flag bridge of a Japanese aircraft carrier at dawn on June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretches out around you. 4 aircraft carriers, the finest in the world, steam in tight formation behind your ship. 6 months ago, you helped bomb Pearl Harbor and killed 2,400 American sailors in a single morning. Now you are here to finish the job. In your mind, this is the day the Pacific belongs to Japan. You do not know that 3 American aircraft carriers are already waiting for you. You do not know that the Americans have read your mail. And you do not know that a slow, ugly, straight-winged American dive bomber that your own experts have already written off is about to walk down out of the clouds and open-pound bomb through the flight deck of your flagship. In 6 minutes, 3 of your 4 carriers will be on fire. In 1 day, all 4 will be gone. And you, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, will never tell your own people what happened. You will take the truth of this morning into a cave on Saipan 2 years from now, put a pistol to your temple, and pull the trigger. This is the Battle of Midway. This is the story of the Japanese admiral who lost the Pacific War in 6 minutes. And this is the story of the slow but deadly aircraft that killed him, 1 bomb at a time, on the morning of June 4th, 1942. The morning was calm. It should not have been. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the flag bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the dawn spread across the Pacific. He was 55 years old. 6 months earlier, he had led the strike force that shattered the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now, on the morning of June 4th, 1942, he believed he was about to finish what he had started. Behind him, 4 aircraft carriers steamed in tight formation. Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, the finest carriers in the world. The Kido Butai, the mobile force, the hammer that had smashed American battleships as they slept in their berths at Ford Island. The blade that had raided Darwin, chased the British from the Indian Ocean, and torn a path across the Pacific that no navy on earth had been able to stop. Nagumo was a torpedo man by training. He had spent his career studying how to sink ships with fish that ran under the sea. He was not a pilot. He had not learned the newer arts of carrier aviation. But seniority in the Imperial Japanese Navy had placed him in command of the greatest carrier force ever assembled. And on this morning, with the sun climbing over Midway Atoll, he was ready to use it. His orders were simple: bomb the American airfield on Midway into rubble. Draw out whatever ships the Americans still had, sink them, and in doing so, complete the destruction of the United States Pacific Fleet that had begun that December morning at Pearl Harbor. 300 miles behind him, aboard the battleship Yamamoto, the largest warship ever built, the man who had designed this entire trap was waiting. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was 58 years old, small, quiet, missing 2 fingers from an old wound at Tsushima. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had watched American factories and American highways with his own eyes, and he understood, more clearly than almost any other Japanese officer, what would happen if this war dragged on. America would outbuild them, outproduce them, bury them under the weight of steel. His only hope was to strike a knockout blow before the American giant woke up. Midway was that blow. His plan was elegant on paper. Nagumo's carriers would bomb the island. When the surviving American ships came to defend it, the combined fleet would ambush them. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Everything Japan had would fall on the wounded American task forces, and when it was over, the Pacific would belong to the Emperor. There was only one thing wrong with the plan. The Americans had already read it. For weeks, In a stifling basement office at Pearl Harbor called Station Hypo, a lieutenant commander named Joseph Rochefort and his codebreakers had been unraveling the Japanese Navy's operational code, known to the Americans as JN-25. Rochefort had lived in the basement for so long he had stopped changing his uniform. He wore a red smoking jacket and slippers to work. And on May 27, 1942, he walked into the office of Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, and told him something Nimitz could scarcely believe. The Japanese were coming to Midway, 4 carriers. First light, June 4th. Nimitz did what almost no other commander in history has ever done. He believed his codebreakers. He gathered every carrier he had, 3 of them, and hid them northeast of Midway, at a spot the American planners named, with quiet gallows humor, Point Luck. While Nagumo steamed east, certain that his enemy was still licking his wounds at Pearl Harbor, 3 American carriers were already sitting silently in the water, waiting for him. The Enterprise, the Hornet, the Yorktown, and on the flight decks of those carriers sat an aircraft that the world had not yet learned to fear. She was not fast, she was not sleek. She looked, from a distance, like an old airplane already. Slab-sided, straight-winged, with a strange perforated flap running along her wing that looked more like a factory grate than anything built for combat. Her name was the Douglas SBD Dauntless. She had been designed by a team led by a young engineer named Edward Heinemann, working for Douglas Aircraft in El Segundo, California. Heinemann had a stubborn belief. He believed a dive bomber did not need to be fast. It needed to be steady. It needed to be strong. It needed to be able to point its nose straight down at a moving ship from 15,000 feet in the air, hold that dive at nearly 70 degrees, take punishment from anti-aircraft fire, and put a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb through the flight deck of an enemy carrier. Everything else was secondary. The perforated flaps on her wings were her secret. When the pilot pulled a lever, they split open like the pages of a book, catching the wind and slowing the aircraft to a controlled, murderous drop. The Dauntless did not scream toward its target. She walked, and that walk gave the pilot time. Time to aim, time to correct, time to make the bomb count. Her top speed was barely 250 miles an hour, slower than the fighter that would try to kill her. Her defensive armament was twin 30-caliber machine guns, mounted back-to-back with the pilot, worked by a gunner sitting behind him. If a Japanese Zero got behind her at altitude, she was almost defenseless. Her pilots, half in affection and half in dark humor, called her by another name, Slow but Deadly. She had entered service before the war began. She had been at Pearl Harbor that December morning, some of her aircraft flying in from the Enterprise, only to be shot at by both sides in the chaos. She had fought at Coral Sea a month earlier and helped send the Japanese light carrier show to the bomb. But no one, on either side of the war, yet understood what she was truly capable of. On this morning of June 4th, 1942, on the flight decks of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, more than 100 SBD Dauntless dive bombers sat with their crews. They did not know where the Japanese carriers were, not yet. But they were about to find out. Back on Akagi, Nagumo checked his watch. 4:30 in the morning. The order went out. Launch the strike. One after another, 108 aircraft roared off the 4 Japanese flight decks. 36 Nakajima Kate bombers converted to carry land bombs. 36 Aichi Val dive bombers. 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters to escort them. It was the same kind of strike force that had crippled Pearl Harbor. Their target was the tiny coral atoll on the horizon. 2 small islands, less than 3 miles across. A marine airstrip, a submarine base, a radio tower. Nothing on Midway was worth what the Japanese were sending against it, except its position. 1,300 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii, the gateway to the Central Pacific. Whoever held Midway held the eastern approaches to Japan itself. The strike disappeared into the west. Nagumo waited. He had held back a second wave, still on his hangar decks, still armed. Some of those planes carried torpedoes, some carried armor-piercing bombs. That was standard doctrine. You always kept a reserve strike ready in case enemy warships appeared unexpectedly. But no enemy warships were going to appear. Nagumo believed that with every fiber of his training, the American carriers were still at Pearl Harbor. He had been told this by intelligence. He had been told this by every briefing. So while his first strike bombed Midway, Nagumo would prepare his hangar decks for the next job. When his aircraft returned, he would rearm them for a second strike on the island. If the Americans did somehow arrive, well, his scout planes would find them first. He had sent 7 Sun Scout planes out at dawn to search the ocean around him. 6 of them launched on time. The 7th did not. The 7th Scout, launched from the heavy cruiser Tone, was designated number 4. It was supposed to search a long fan of ocean to the southeast. The exact quadrant where the American carriers were at that very moment waiting. But Tone's catapult had jammed. For 30 minutes, sailors on Tone worked to free it. 30 minutes while the sun climbed higher. 30 minutes while the American carriers, unseen, launched their own scout planes and began to move into striking position. When Scout number 4 finally roared off Tone's catapult and turned to the southeast, it was already too late. The delay would not seem important at that moment. It would seem important later. It would seem, in fact, to be the most important 30 minutes of the entire Pacific War. Because in those 30 minutes, Chuichi Nagumo lost the war. He just did not know it yet. The clock on the bulkhead read 7:05 in the morning. Nagumo received the first message from his commanders over Midway. The attack had gone well. The runways were cratered. The oil tanks were burning. The seaplane hangar was gone. But the American airfield was still functional. A second strike would be needed. The words came from the flight leader, Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, a professional's assessment made under fire. And they placed on Nagumo's shoulders the weight of a decision that no one in that war would ever forget. His reserve aircraft, sitting in the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Weapons designed to kill ships. Weapons useless against sand and coral and concrete airstrips. If he wanted to hit Midway again, and hit it hard, he would need to change those weapons. Remove the torpedoes. Bring up the fragmentation bombs. It would take an hour. During that hour, his flight decks would be full of aircraft with the wrong ordnance, unable to launch, exposed. But no American carrier had appeared. His scout planes had been out for hours and reported nothing. At 7:15 in the morning, Nagumo made his decision. Rearm. Down in the hangar decks of Akakagi and Kaga, the ordnance crews began to work. They rolled the wheeled dollies. They unbolted the torpedoes from the bellies of the Nakajima Kate bombers, one after another, their hands slick with oil and sweat. They wheeled the torpedoes toward the magazines to be stowed away. They wheeled the fragmentation bombs up and began the long, careful task of attaching them. It was hot, dangerous work, the kind of work you do not rush. Torpedoes weighed nearly 2,000 pounds. Fragmentation bombs weighed 500. A single mistake, one dropped wrench, one loose chain, and the hangar deck would become an abattoir. The men worked as fast as they dared. 13 minutes later, the message came. Aboard the heavy cruiser Tone, the radioman of Scout Number 4, the plane that had been delayed 30 minutes at launch, sent a signal that would freeze every officer on Akagi's bridge. Sighted enemy force, 10 ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. 10 ships. Nagumo read the message twice. 10 ships did not mean carriers. 10 ships could mean anything. Cruisers, a patrol force sent to defend the invasion convoy. The kind of target his torpedo-armed reserve had been perfectly configured to destroy 1 hour ago, before he had given the order to rearm. He needed to know more. He signaled back to Tone. What kind of ships? Are there carriers? The response did not come back for another 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes, Nagumo waited. His crew worked. Torpedoes came off. Fragmentation bombs went on. And somewhere, out beyond the northeastern horizon, 3 American carriers he did not know existed were already turning their bows into the wind. At 7:28 in the morning, Tone 4's radio operator sent one more line. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be 1 aircraft carrier. Nagumo's expression did not change. It was said later by those who served with him that his expression almost never changed. But the men on the bridge felt the moment as clearly as if a shell had struck the ship. An enemy carrier. Everything he had been told was wrong. Now he faced a second decision, more urgent than the first. His reserve, half-rearmed, was in chaos. If he launched now, with fragmentation bombs against a warship at sea, the attack would be pitiful. Bombs designed to kill men in the open would bounce off armored decks. But if he stopped the rearming and reversed it, put the torpedoes back on, he would lose another hour. And in that hour, the American carrier might strike first. The correct answer, the answer that Japanese admirals would argue about for the rest of their lives, was to launch immediately with whatever weapons his aircraft carried. Even a weak strike, delivered first, would keep the enemy busy defending himself. It would buy time. But Nagumo was a torpedo man. He had spent his whole career believing that half measures killed sailors. He wanted his strike to be full and correct and deadly. Shortly after 8:30 in the morning, he gave the order, change the fragmentation bombs back, bring the torpedoes up again. For the second time in less than an hour, on the sweltering hangar decks of Akagi and Kaga and Hiryu and Soryu, exhausted ordnance crews began the whole process in reverse. Bombs came off. Torpedoes came back up. But now there was a new problem. There was no time to stow the fragmentation bombs properly in the magazines. There was no time for anything. The men simply set the bombs down where they stood, rolled them against the bulkheads, stacked them beside the aircraft, wherever there was space. Hundreds of live bombs exposed on open hangar decks, alongside torpedoes, alongside aviation fuel lines, alongside fully armed and fueled aircraft. It was the worst possible arrangement. Any experienced carrier officer knew it, but there was no choice, and the sky above them was about to become very crowded. The first Americans to find Nagumo did not arrive from the sea. They came from Midway. The atoll's air commander had scrambled every airplane he had the moment the Japanese fleet was spotted. Marine Corps Vindicators, B-26, Marauders modified to carry torpedoes, old Grumman Avengers on their combat debut. 6 torpedo planes, 4 B-26s, all of them obsolete or untried, all of them flying alone, without fighter escort, toward the deadliest carrier force in the world. They came in low, skimming the waves. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners tracked them down and shot them apart. Of the 6 Avengers, 1 returned. Of the 4 B-26s, 2 returned. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. It was, by any measure, a slaughter. But it did something Nagumo could not have anticipated. It kept his carriers turning to dodge torpedoes, turning to keep their bows into the wind, turning and turning and turning so that they could never assemble a full strike on their own flight decks. Every time the ordnance crews got close to being ready, another wave of Americans came from a different direction, and the carriers had to maneuver, and the deck crews had to freeze and hold on. The morning burned away. 9 o'clock came and went. 10 o'clock approached, and still the Kido Butai had not launched its counterstrike. Then came the carrier planes. They came from the east, in 3 separate torpedo squadrons, from 3 separate American carriers, launched at different times, arriving raggedly and alone. The first was Torpedo Squadron 8, from the carrier Hornet, led by a lieutenant commander named John Waldron. Waldron was a hard, weather-beaten man of part Sioux ancestry, and before his squadron had launched, he had gathered his young pilots and told them, in words that would be quoted forever after, that if only one plane was left at the end, he wanted that plane to go in and get a hit. Waldron flew a Douglas TBD Devastator. It was the American Navy's frontline torpedo bomber, and by any honest measure it was already obsolete. Slow, fragile, armed with torpedoes so poorly designed that many of them would not even detonate on impact. In a straight line, at low altitude, a Devastator was one of the easiest targets in the sky. 15 of them, 15 Devastators of Torpedo 8, bore in on the Kido Butai without fighter escort, without any cover at all, low over the water. The Japanese Zeros fell on them. Every single Devastator was shot down. Every single one. Of the 30 men who flew that mission, 29 died in the water or in the burning wrecks of their aircraft. One survived. His name was George Gay. He was 25 years old, an ensign on his first combat mission. His plane hit the water, and he crawled out of it, wounded, and clung to a floating rubber seat cushion. And there, from the waves, he watched the rest of what was about to happen. Behind Torpedo 8 came Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise. 14 Devastators. 10 of them were shot down. Behind Torpedo 6 came Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown. 12 Devastators. 10 of them were shot down. In less than an hour, 41 American torpedo bombers had attacked Nagumo's carriers. 35 of them had been destroyed. Not one torpedo had hit a Japanese ship. Not one. By any measure that the Japanese used, and by any measure that the American commanders back at Point Luck would use, it was a disaster. But something else had happened during that hour, something that no one on the Japanese side could yet see. Every Zero fighter in the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been drawn down to the waves, down to the level of the dying Devastators, down to 100 feet above the sea, to 200 feet, to 500 feet. They were low and slow, hunting stragglers, burning fuel out of position and out of ammunition. And the sky above them, up at 15,000 feet, was empty. 60 miles east, another group of Americans was still looking for the fight. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey was 39 years old, the Air Group commander of the Enterprise, flying an SBD Dauntless. Behind him, in loose formations, stretched 32 more Dauntlesses. 33 aircraft in total, from Scouting 6 and Bombing 6. They had launched hours earlier. They had flown to the coordinates where the Japanese carriers were supposed to be. The coordinates were empty. McCluskey looked down at his fuel gauge. The needle was moving toward numbers he did not like to read. Every Dauntless in his formation had the same problem. They had flown too far, they had waited too long, and now they were burning fuel in the empty air, over an empty sea with an empty horizon. He was supposed to turn back. Every rule of navigation and prudence said that at this fuel state, he should turn for home and try to make it to the Enterprise before he had to ditch. McCluskey did not turn back. He gritted his teeth. He turned his formation west. He flew in a wide search pattern, hoping for anything at all. And he saw a white line on the sea. It was thin, and it was fast, and at first he thought it might be a whale. Then he understood. It was a ship's wake. A wake pointing like an arrow across the ocean. The ship at the head of that wake was a Japanese destroyer named Arashi. She had spent the last hour trying to sink an American submarine, the Nautilus, and now, having given up, she was racing back to rejoin her fleet at flank speed. She was drawing a straight, white line across the ocean, straight to Nagumo. McCluskey did not know any of that. He only knew that a destroyer running that hard was running towards something worth defending. He turned his formation to follow the wake. 10 minutes later, at 15,000 feet, the horizon began to fill. Dark shapes, long, narrow, moving, the formations of the Kido Butai spread out across the sea. Below him, turning, empty in the sky. At almost the same moment, without either group knowing about the other, a second American formation appeared from the northeast. 17 Dauntlesses of Bombing 3. From the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, 2 American dive bomber squadrons, 50 aircraft, converging by pure accident on the same target at the same second. Nagumo had never even looked up. On the flight deck of Akagi, the first Zero fighter was just beginning to taxi for takeoff. Another combat air patrol scrambling to chase the American torpedo plane still burning on the water. The real counterstrike was still below, in the hangar, half-armed and going nowhere. The ordnance crews were still working. The bombs were still stacked in the wrong places. The torpedoes were still not all loaded. At 10:20 in the morning, on June 4, 1942, the sky over the Kido Butai split open. McCluskey picked his target. 2 carriers were closest to him, side by side, the Kaga to the left, the Akagi to the right, farther and smaller from his angle. He called over the radio to his squadron leaders. Earl, you and I take the one on the left. Best, you take the one on the right. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, commanding Scouting 6, heard him. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing 6, did not. The radio signal did not carry. In the confusion of an attack forming up above an enemy fleet, Best only saw McCluskey and Gallagher rolling into their dives ahead of him. Both squadrons were converging on the same carrier, the Kaga. Best saw it, he understood. He waggled his ailerons. He closed his flaps. He tried, in the last seconds before his dive, to signal to his men to break off. Only 2 of them saw him. His 2 wingmen, Lieutenant Ed Kroeger and Ensign Frederick Weber. The rest of Bombing 6 followed McCluskey and Gallagher down. Best did what a squadron leader is supposed to do. He held his target. Akagi, the flagship, the one he had been assigned. He and Kroeger and Weber climbed it clear and turned and rolled into their dive alone. 3 Dauntlesses, 3,000-pound bombs, 1 carrier. Below them, McCluskey and Gallagher and 25 other Dauntlesses were already pounding the Kaga. The Japanese lookouts finally saw them. Someone on Kaga's bridge screamed the word that had never been screamed in this war before. Not against these ships. Not from above. Kyuko, dive, bombers. The first bomb missed, the second missed, and then the world of the Kido Butai ended. Bomb after bomb walked across Kaga's flight deck at 4-second intervals. 400-pounders, 500-pounders, 1,000-pounders. Steel-cased armor-piercing weapons, designed by American engineers to punch through a carrier's deck and detonate in her belly. The first hit exploded near Kaga's island. The second hit exploded her bridge, The captain, the officer of the deck, every man standing there died in a single flash of light. The third and fourth bombs found what the crews had left on the hangar deck: the exposed fragmentation bombs, the stacked, unstowed weapons that no one had had time to put away. Kaga exploded from the inside. At the same instant, 5 miles away, the same thing was happening to Soryu. Leslie's Dauntlesses from Yorktown had picked her out, putting bomb after bomb into her flight deck. 3 hits, 1,000 pounds each, in less than a minute. Soryu's fuel lines ruptured. Her ready ammunition detonated. She turned into a floating funeral pyre. Above the burning Kaga, 3 Dauntlesses were still climbing away and turning east. Dick Best rolled into his dive on Akagi. She was the largest carrier in the world when she was launched, 855 feet long, 40,000 tons of armor and fuel and steel. She was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. She was the flagship. And on her bridge, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was still standing, still watching, still trying to understand what had happened to the world in the last 30 seconds. Best held his dive at nearly 70 degrees. The Dauntless's split flaps were open. The aircraft walked down through the sky, slow and steady, exactly as Ed Heinemann had designed her to do. At 1,500 feet, Best pulled the release lever. The 1,000-pound bomb dropped from the belly of his aircraft and fell in a long, clean arc. It struck Akagi almost exactly amidships, punched through the flight deck, and detonated in the upper hangar bay. Directly beneath it, packed wing to wing, were 18 Nakajima Kate bombers still in the middle of being rearmed. Torpedoes lying on the deck, bombs stacked against the bulkheads, aviation fuel lines open. The center of the Akagi ceased to exist. The blast wave rolled through the ship. Elevators buckled. Aircraft on the flight deck flipped into the sea. Steel plating peeled back from the deck like paper. And on the flag bridge, Nagumo felt the ship shudder beneath his feet in a way no carrier is ever supposed to shudder. 6 minutes. At 10:20 in the morning, the Kido Butai had been the most powerful naval force on the planet. At 10:26 in the morning, 3 of its 4 carriers were on fire and dying. The Dauntlesses climbed away and turned for home. Below them, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers burned. And on the ruined bridge of the Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the man who had led the strike on Pearl Harbor, stood alone in the smoke and understood, for the first time, what had just been done to him. 60 miles to the north, 1 Japanese carrier had not been hit. Her name was Hiryu, the Flying Dragon, the 4th ship of the Kido Butai, and by the accident of formation, the only one still moving under her own power. Her flight deck was intact, her hangar was intact, and on her bridge stood a man who was not willing to accept what had just happened. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi was 49 years old. He was the 3rd son of a samurai family from the old Matsue domain. He had graduated near the top of his class at the Naval Academy. He had studied at Princeton. He had commanded the 2nd Carrier Division of the Kido Butai for years. And among the Japanese naval officers who understood carrier aviation better than any torpedo man ever would, Yamaguchi was considered the best of them all. Many in the Imperial Navy believed he would one day succeed Yamamoto himself. Yamaguchi looked at the burning shapes on the horizon. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. His entire world was on fire, and on the flight deck of Hiryu, he still had 18 dive bombers and 10 torpedo planes ready to fly. He ordered them into the air. They flew east, hunting. They found the Yorktown. The Yorktown had been the least damaged of the 3 American carriers at Point Luck, but she was still the oldest, still the most patched together. Her repairs from Coral Sea 1 month earlier had been done in 72 hours, instead of the 90 days her yardman had asked for. She had gone into this battle with welds still cooling. Hiryu's dive bombers put 3 bombs into her. Hiryu's torpedo planes put 2 torpedoes into her side. Yorktown listed. Her power died. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, gave the order to abandon ship, and hundreds of American sailors went into the water while she rolled slowly to port. But Yorktown did not sink. Not that day. She would float, wounded and silent, for 2 more days, until a Japanese submarine named I-168 found her drifting and put 2 more torpedoes into her on the afternoon of June 6th. Yorktown finally rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7th. Only then, at last, was the old carrier gone. Yamaguchi did not know any of that. He only knew he had struck a blow, and he intended to strike another. He began arming his last strike. The Americans were faster. Late in the afternoon, from the Enterprise, 24 SBD Dauntlesses lifted into the sky. 10 of them were refugees from Yorktown. Aircraft that had landed on Enterprise after their own ship was disabled, refueled, and rearmed by Enterprise crews in less than an hour. Among the pilots was Lieutenant Richard Best, flying his second combat mission of the day. His flight suit was still stained with the smoke of Akagi. They flew north through the lengthening light. They found Hiryu at 5 o'clock in the evening. Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened up. Zeros climbed to intercept. Hiryu herself turned hard, so hard that her heeling deck emptied one of her machine gun mounts into the sea. She was the most agile of the 4 Japanese carriers, and she fought like it. The first bomb missed. So did the second. So did the third. Hiryu was a moving target, twisting under the falling weapons. Then the Dauntlesses of Bombing 3, Lieutenant Dave Shumway's squadron, joined the attack. Best turned in beside them, and together, in a coordinated dive that no Zero could stop, the Americans put 4 1,000-pound bombs into the forward third of Hiryu's flight deck. The bombs struck almost on top of one another. They tore Hiryu's bow apart. Her forward elevator was blown clean out of its housing and thrown upward against the front of her island in a single piece. Her forward hangar exploded from within, and below decks, the fuel and the bombs that Yamaguchi had been assembling for his next strike detonated in a chain that ripped the guts out of the ship. In 12 hours, on a single day, the SBD Dauntless, the aircraft that no one had learned to fear, had killed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 6 months of building, a generation of training. Every advantage Japan had brought to this war. Gone. Hiryu did not sink at once. She burned all evening. She burned into the night. And on her bridge, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi made a decision that no American commander in the Pacific ever had to make. He decided he would not leave her. Around midnight, Yamaguchi gathered the 800 men still aboard Hiryu on the burning flight deck near her ruined island. He led them in 3 cries of banzai toward Tokyo. The ship's band, or what was left of it, played the Japanese national anthem, and then he ordered them, all of them, off the ship. Only 2 men stayed behind, Yamaguchi and Hiryu's captain, Tomeo Kaku, 49 years old, an old friend and colleague. 2 officers sharing hard sea biscuits and cups of water on the tilting deck of a dying ship. The moon was up. Yamaguchi looked at his old friend and said something the sailors climbing over the side would remember for the rest of their lives. "Let us enjoy the beauty of the moon." Kaku looked at the sky and answered, "How bright it shines. It must be in its 21st day." The men climbing down the ropes into the destroyers below looked up once and saw the 2 officers waving to them from the bridge. And then the ropes were cut, and then the destroyer Makigumo, on Yamaguchi's own final order, fired a torpedo into Hiryu's hull to hasten her end. Hiryu did not sink until the next morning. 300 miles to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the news of what had happened to his 4 carriers. The men on Yamato's bridge remembered later that he did not speak for a long time. Then he cancelled the operation. All of it, the invasion of Midway, the trap for the American fleet, the dream of ending the war before the American factories woke up, all of it. He turned his ships around and steamed for home, but he did something else before he steamed home that no one in the American Navy knew about for 3 years. He gave an order that the truth of Midway was to be buried. The Japanese sailors who had survived the sinking of Akagi and Kaga and Soryu and Hiyu, hundreds of oil-soaked, half-burned men, were quarantined the moment they returned to Japan. Many of them were not allowed to set foot on land. Many were transferred directly from one ship to another and sent immediately to the Solomon Islands, to Guadalcanal, where the next Pacific meat grinder was already spinning up. Some of the wounded were kept in isolation wards for months. They were forbidden to speak, even to their own families, about what had happened. Radio Tokyo told the Japanese people that Midway had been a victory, that 2 American carriers had been sunk, that the Imperial fleet had returned in triumph. Nagumo was not disciplined. Nagumo was not questioned in public. Yamamoto could not afford, in the summer of 1942, to let the Japanese people learn how badly they had just lost. The truth of what those 6 minutes had done to the Imperial Japanese Navy would not become known to the Japanese public until the war itself was over in the summer of 1945, 3 long years later. By that time, all 3 of the Japanese admirals who had stood on Nagumo's carriers that morning would be dead. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi went down with the Hiryu on the morning of June 5, 1942, at the age of 49. He was posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral and awarded the Order of the Golden Kite, First Class. His body was never recovered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto lived 10 more months. On the morning of April 18, 1943, he boarded a Betty bomber for an inspection flight to the front lines in the Solomons. American codebreakers, working from the same JN-25 that had betrayed the Midway plan, had read his schedule. 16 P-38 Lightnings were waiting for him in the sky over Bougainville. First Lieutenant Rex Barber put his 50 caliber and 20mm fire into Yamamoto's aircraft and sent it burning into the jungle. Yamamoto, 59 years old, was killed in his seat before the plane hit the ground. He was buried with a state funeral. Japan mourned him for weeks. What the Japanese people did not know was that the same weakness that had killed him had killed his carriers 1 year earlier, in 6 minutes at Midway. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo lived the longest of the 3. After Midway, he was quietly moved from one lesser command to another. Guadalcanal, the home islands, backwaters. In March of 1944, with Japan's situation collapsing, he was sent to the Mariana Islands to organize the defense of Saipan. It was, everyone understood, a punishment posting, a place to die honorably, far from Tokyo. The Americans came in June. On the 6th of July, 1944, with Saipan lost and American Marines closing in on his command post, Nagumo went into a cave on the northern end of the island. He was 57 years old. He did not perform the traditional seppuku that a defeated Japanese admiral was expected to perform. Instead, he took out a pistol, put it to his temple, and pulled the trigger. American Marines found his body in the cave a few days later. He had never, in the 2 years between Midway and Saipan, spoken publicly about what had happened on the morning of June 4th. He had never explained the 2 orders to change the ordnance. He had never explained the 30 minutes he had waited for the Tone Scout. He had taken the truth of those 6 minutes with him into the cave, and out over the Pacific, the SBD Dauntless flew on. She flew at Guadalcanal. She flew at Santa Cruz. She flew at the Philippine Sea. 5,936 Dauntlesses came off the Douglas assembly lines during the war. When she was finally retired from frontline service in 1944, replaced by faster and heavier aircraft, she had sunk more Japanese warship tonnage than any other Allied aircraft of the entire Pacific War. No fighter, no torpedo bomber, no heavy bomber came close. Slow but deadly, the nickname stuck. The men who flew her said it with affection. But the Japanese sailors who had watched her come down out of the clouds over the Kido Butai on the morning of June 4th, 1942, said it with something else. They said it with the memory of a small, straight-winged American aircraft walking down through the sky at 70 degrees, patient and precise, holding its dive until the flight deck of a Japanese carrier filled its bomb sight. 6 minutes. At 10:20 in the morning, Chuichi Nagumo commanded the greatest carrier force in the world. At 10:26 in the morning, 3 of his 4 carriers were burning, and by nightfall, all 4 were gone. He never told his own people what happened. He never had to. The war told them in the end. Slowly, island by island, carrier by carrier, until at last there were no carriers left, and no fleet left, and no empire left to hide the truth from. A Japanese admiral had stood on a bridge at dawn, believing the ocean belonged to him. By afternoon, it did not. And the aircraft that took it from him was a 2-seat American dive bomber that the world had already written off as too slow to matter.